Hi, and welcome to the Story Rebel Masterclass. Today we're going to be talking about co-writing nonfiction books with Matty Dalrymple and Michael Ronn. Matty and Michael are both fantastic resources for authors, particularly indie authors. And on top of that, they're both just wonderful, wonderful humans. I've had the pleasure of getting to know both of them over the last few years. So I know they've got a lot of great advice for us, so I'm going to do a quick introduction, then we'll get into the interview. Matty Dalrymple is the author of the Lizzie Ballard thrillers and the Anne Kinnear suspense novels and suspense shorts. She's a member of International Thriller Writers and Sisters in Crime. Matty also podcasts, writes, speaks, and consults on the writing craft and the publishing voyage as the indie author. Her articles have appeared in Writer's Digest magazine, and she's a partner member of the Alliance of Independent Authors. You can find her fiction at mattydalrymple.com and her resources and books for authors at theindieauthor.com. That's indie with a Y. Michael Ronn, also known as M.L. Ronn, has published over 90 science fiction and fantasy books and self-help books for writers. He built a writing career publishing 10 to 12 books per year while raising a family, working a full-time job, and even attending law school classes in the evenings. Visit his fiction website at michaellaronn.com and his resources for writers at authorlevelup.com. Matty and Michael have co-written several nonfiction books together, including From Page to Platform, How to Succeed as an Author Speaker, as well as a book on co-authoring nonfiction called Collaborate to Create. So I'm going to drop a link to that book in the comments or show notes if you're watching this later. But that's theindieauthor.com/collaborate. And on that page, you're also going to find a useful collaboration workbook. And there's also a really great presentation which they did for the Authors Guild. So I recommend watching that. So Matty and Michael, you've both collaborated with each other, obviously, but also with other authors. Can you both talk about your collaboration experience? And Matty, why don't you go first?
Sure. So the two people I have collaborated with on nonfiction books are Michael and Mark Lefebvre. And I think it's interesting because I think it's an illustration that two people who are quite alike in their approach can work well together, and two people who are quite different in their approach can work well together. So I would say Michael and I are fairly alike in the sense that we're both like highly organized people. We have kind of a similar approach to our publishing and things like that. I would say Mark and I are more dissimilar because let's say project management wouldn't be Mark Lefebvre's preferred thing to do. He's certainly more than able to do it because he has organized these kind of collaborations himself. He has, played the project manager role, but that was one where like Mark was happy to have somebody else take on that role. So I think it's not that there are definite, yes, this will work and no, this won't work. It's that you need to think about those things ahead of time. Like it's just as possible that two people who have very similar approaches could run into problems as work smoothly together. And so, there were learnings on both those sides, but both of them can be successful.
And Michael,
Yeah,
you've
yeah,
also co-written fiction. Sorry for jumping in.
yeah. I work with Maddie on a few projects, and she's right. We both are very similar in terms of how we are organized and how we think. I also have collaborated on fiction. So my friend Justin Sloan, we wrote a novel together, and it was kind of like one of those serendipitous moments where we both wrote fiction novels separately, like independently, that were very similar. And so we thought, oh, well, we were talking and we kind of had personality, we gelled really well. And we thought, well, our writing styles are similar. We like kind of the same things. We like a lot of the same books. What if we wrote a book together? And so we collaborated on a fiction series called Modern Necromancy, which was a 3-book series. And it was a really, really interesting experience, just learning how we work together collaboratively from a fiction perspective. So while I've collaborated with Maddie on nonfiction, I've also done the fiction as well.
Gotcha. And when you're looking for a collaboration partner, or I guess, kind of both of these seemed like they came about a little bit more serendipitously. What are you looking for? What sort of traits? Michael, why don't you start with that?
Yeah, I'm looking for somebody that's going to be on the same wavelength in terms of approach, income, all of that, because there have been people who've wanted to collaborate with me in the past who they are just extremely focused on the money and the growth part. And for me, I care more about like the process and connecting with readers and building a community and enjoying the the currency of ideas as opposed to being super mercenary on the money piece. So there are some people that are just not going to be a fit for me just from a personality perspective. So I think personality is good. Also, forgive me for speaking a little French, but I just don't want to collaborate with somebody that is going to be a pain in the ass. Right. And I think you kind of have a gut sense of when you work with somebody, whether this person is going to be somebody that if things go south, is this somebody that you want to go south with? And I think that's important. And I think it's important to follow your gut. But ultimately it's about interest and having fun and also being able to hit whatever outcomes you want, whether that be income or market reach. One of the reasons Maddie and I think we've collaborated so well is that we both have similar audiences. And so from a nonfiction perspective, it's really easy for me to send people to Maddie, right? I've had tons of leads and things that I send to her. She has, opportunities that she sends to me. And it just from a synergistic perspective makes a lot of sense. And so I would say personality and synergy are probably the two things that I would look for the most with a collaborator. Maddie, thoughts?
Yeah, I have found that my collaborations have mainly come about through being an active member of the writing and publishing community. And so the first book I co-authored with Mark Lefebvre, which was Taking the Short Tack, Creating Income and Connecting with Readers Using Short Fiction, came about because Mark had mentioned he had done a podcast episode on the Stark Reflections podcast about short fiction, and he had just made like a passing comment about ways you can use short fiction for reaching readers and creating income. And I, as a supporter of his podcast, sent him a note and said, "Oh, that sounded really interesting. Could you do a whole podcast episode about that?" Which he did. And then I further followed up and said, I think there's enough here for a book. And I also recognized that although at that point I had a lot of experience indie publishing short fiction, Mark had tons and tons of experience traditionally publishing short fiction. And so I also recognized that he was able to fill a gap there that I wouldn't be able to fill. And then the first book that Michael and I co-authored was because we were both at the Writer's Digest conference. We were speakers there, and we were kind of talking about the tips and tricks we'd picked up to, get speaking engagements, chatting over dinner. And when that dinner was done, we thought, whoa, I think we have enough to make a book here. And then, of course, once we had co-authored one book, we were like, guess what? Now we have a whole different set of, best practices about co-authoring that we can capture in a book. And then moving back to the kind of community theme, the second book I co-authored with Mark, which was the Podcast Guest Playbook, came about because I was like maybe 85% through what I wanted to say about podcast guesting best practices. And I had lunch with Mark at Author Nation, and I was telling him about this book. And as we were walking from the restaurant back to the conference, he said, "Oh, are you looking for a co-author on that?" And I said, yes, in fact, I am. I didn't realize it until just this moment, because I realized that what Mark had to bring there was lots and lots of great personal stories that illustrated the points that both of us wanted to make in the book. So I think it's just a theme that the more active you are in interacting with the members of your community, the more those opportunities present themselves.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And Maddie, I wanted to ask you, you knew Michael well before you collaborated, but it sounds like you knew Mark more as a listener of the podcast, less than a friend. Is that correct?
Yes, at that point, I think that's true.
Yeah. So what was the difference in approaching those collaborations with somebody that you're like, okay, I know you well, I know how you work, versus somebody that you're like, okay, I know you at a distance, let's figure out how we work together?
Well, I would say one thing is that both Mark and Michael have pristine reputations in the writing and publishing space. And so the whole due diligence that we recommend you undertake before you embarked on a co-author project was something that I had already done, just in the sense that I was interacting with them either one-on-one, like I was a member of their audience or I was one of their colleagues. And so I kind of felt like I had a good sense of Mark, both in terms of the expertise he would bring and just how he is as a person, by having been a longtime listener of the Stark Reflections podcast. And I also think it was slightly different because at that point, that was earlier in my career, and I felt a little more like I was asking a favor of someone in terms of participating, whereas as things went on later, it felt more like a true partnership. because I felt like at that point I had gained enough followers and reputation and so on that it was a little bit more of an equal contribution in terms of what we were bringing in a marketing and branding point of view. But I just think that either by knowing a person through their presence, their publicly available presence, or knowing them in person as I came to know both Michael and Mark, I was able to see those markers that made me think that they would be good people to work with.
Can you talk a little bit more about the type of due diligence that you recommend people do?
Yes. Well, anything you should not go for. One thing I'll say is if you're friends with someone, this is not enough.
True.
Like, I think sometimes people get into these co-authoring relationships because they're both in they've both been going to the same writers group meeting for 5 years. And someone says, oh, I'm looking for someone to write this book with. And the other person says, yeah, that sounds like a good idea. And yet they don't know, has the other person written before? Have they published before? What's the quality of work they've published? Have they published books? Have they published articles? How are those books or articles been received? And so there's a lot of due diligence in terms of just making sure that this is someone who you want to hitch your wagon to, as I'm sure we'll talk about. Co-authoring is kind of like a creative marriage. And is this someone you want to enter into that kind of partnership with? Google is your friend. Make sure that, there isn't something going on behind the scenes that either would indicate that this is someone you don't want to associate yourself with, or who might not be a good expertise match or personality match or something like that. So those are some of the due diligence things that we recommend that people do before they approach someone. And then Michael, maybe I'll turn it over to you to say, to talk a little bit about what are the things that you want to talk about with the person to make sure it's a good match.
Yeah, I think talking is really important. So something that Justin Sloan and I did that was really, really helpful is we just got on the phone and just talked. We had a couple of different phone conversations. Like the first conversation was just, hey, you write books about cool teddy bear protagonists. I write books about cool teddy bear protagonists. And then we just talked about stuff. And then the second call was, okay, what would a collaboration look like? And so we talked about it, and I got to know his goals and he got to know mine. And, they were a little different in some cases, but they were pretty complementary. And then, the third call was more, oh, what if we wrote a novel about this? And what if it was that? And we started batting around the idea just as a proof of concept. And when we felt like that could be kind of a cool thing that we could do, and we felt like we were trading some things back and forth on a Google Doc, just so I could see what it was like to work with him and what it was like to work with me. And we both felt pretty comfortable about it. At that point, we really started talking about the details of, okay, well, what if we did write a series together? What would that look like? Who would market it? Who would publish it? How would the royalty splits look like? And then we memorialized that in a contract. And, hopefully I'm not getting too far ahead here, but I do think that a contract is important because, one, it will help preserve the friendship, especially if you have a friend, because everybody is clear on what happens, right? Who gets what, where it gets published, copyright, all that stuff. And then, what happens if there's disputes, right? And everybody's, hopefully is on the same page about what happens in the event that there is some sort of a conflict. And I think as part of the due diligence, and we can talk about the contracts later, but in terms of the due diligence, if the person that you're potentially wanting to collaborate with doesn't want to sign a contract, that's a red flag. Or if you can't even come to an agreement on what a contract should look like in terms of terms, then that's a red flag. I think that a contract protects everybody, right? Because you've done all that work that Matty talks about looking up the person, asking around within your network, whether this person is a potential risk, that sort of thing. Then you want to make sure you protect yourself in writing. Because unfortunately, even if you do all of the right work and all of the right due diligence, sometimes there's conflicts. And so having a contract will protect both of you in the event that happens. And it just ensures that everybody's speaking the same language, everybody's on the same page, and that, down the road, 10, 15 years later, when memories fade, it's clear what the original intent was.
Yeah, I think that it doesn't even take that long for memories to fade because I remember being very glad I had a contract to reference because um, a new retail platform came up, and I couldn't remember if Michael and I or Mark and I had talked about how we would handle that. And I was able to go back to the contract and say, oh, yeah, I see that we did or we didn't. And in this case, it was new. We hadn't. We, did a tiny update to the contract. And so I think sometimes it's more comfortable for people to think of the contract as where do you capture your agreements so you don't have to keep revisiting them. And
Exactly.
and down the road, you can go back and say, oh, yeah, that was intentional. Or, oh, no, we've identified a hole and now we can fill it with a little addendum. And sometimes that's more comfortable than thinking of it on the surface as a way to resolve disputes.
Yeah, I
Right.
can't remember that retailer, but Maddie, you sent me a text message about it, and then I think we had a call the next week, and then we had a contract addendum signed like by the end of that day or like the end of that weekend or something. I mean, it was like a non-issue, and that's
Yeah,
that's the kind of partnership you want, right? Just
yeah.
you come up with a question, you both talk about it, you move forward.
Yeah, I remember one of the things that was an addendum for my contract with Mark was we had not covered what to do about um, direct sales. Like if Mark went to a writers conference and sold a bunch of copies of the book, like what happened to the proceeds? And we both agreed that if he bought the books, then he got to keep all the money that he got from those in-person events. So you're right, it wasn't not a matter of an argument. It was just a matter of saying, oh yeah, this makes sense to both of us. We just need to capture it so we remember it.
In a way, it's almost like creating that contract together is your first co-writing project. And so, Michael, to your
Yeah.
point, if you're struggling with somebody to even put together a contract, it's probably going to be tough to co-write an entire book.
Just think about it like this. If you have a difficult time just having a conversation, what's it going to be like down the road if you have a contract with that person and you come up with some sort of a dispute, right? Like you're doing both of you're doing both of you a service by doing that. It's just a way to vet, and it's something you'll
Mhm.
thank yourself for in a parallel universe, maybe.
Absolutely. So, speaking of contracts, what are some of the specific clauses that people need to be thinking about?
I always lob any
Yeah.
contract questions to Michael.
Okay. Okay. Yeah. I
Yeah.
mean, there's a bunch, but I think before we even talk about terms, I think contracts scare people. People hear contracts and they seize up and they think, oh my gosh, this is scary. I don't know where to start. And really, I think the best contracts are in plain English, right? So you don't need to do any of the thou shalt or should, the legal terms. Just it should be in plain English that everybody understands, right? So you don't have to be complicated with it. But what I would also say is that in terms of terms, there are just a few things that I think are primary. There's a lot of other things that we could probably spend a whole hour talking about, but I think that the primary thing is royalties. So what is the split for all formats, right? What do you do if you have an amazing success and you get approached by Hollywood, right? What would it look like in that particular scenario where you're both really successful and it's not really a royalty structure, right? So you want to be thinking about like ebooks and paperbacks and direct sales, but you also want to be thinking about success, right? What does success look like? And if you want to do things like Kickstarters or you want to shop things around, like Justin and I, we wanted to shop our trilogy out to different movie studios and things like that. So we did some research on what that would look like, and he would take a majority because he would be doing the majority of the work, right? And so I was happy to have him do that and take the majority of the work as long as I got something from it, right? So the money is, I think, an important part, but also the control. So who control? Okay, so let's say Maddie and I have a dispute on where the period in the sentence goes, okay, or how the sentence should end, or where the comma goes. Okay, well, who has the final say? Okay. Well, Maddie and I both agreed that it would be Maddie because Maddie is publishing the book through her publishing company. And so if heaven forbid, Maddie and I get into a fist fight or something one day, Maddie's going to win at the end of the day because I give her that control. Okay. So the control is also important. Who publishes the book? And then I think another third one, and I'll just end at three, is what happens if one of you becomes incapacitated or were to pass away. So as Maddie mentioned, this is a creative marriage in a way. Like the book you create or any project you create, think about it. The copyright, you're going to control that for your lives plus 70 years. So whatever book you create in a perfect world, assuming it remains for sale and can be distributed everywhere after you're gone, this is something you could pass down to your children, maybe even grandchildren, or whatever your heir situation looks like. So understanding what happens if, I were to become incapacitated. Let's say I'm in a coma for a really long time and Maddie needs to make decisions about the book. What do we do in that situation? What happens if, heaven forbid, I were to pass away? Well, Maddie would have to work with my wife, right? And so you have to think through those sorts of situations as well, because inevitably, it's going to happen at some point or another.
Yeah, I'll just add one thing that people can consider beyond a formally signed contract. I totally agree with everything Michael said. There are some things that you want to come to an agreement on, but they're not really contract necessary, or they might change too often. So as an example, one of our recommendations is that if you're working with other professionals like cover designers or editors, you only have one person who's the contact for that person.
Yeah.
And so if you're working with a cover designer, and then Michael and I would need to thrash through our spec for the cover, and then one of us would be the person who would go to the cover designer and convey that and convey any of the cover designer's questions back to the partnership. That's the kind of thing. I don't think it needs to be in a contract, but it's nice to have like a companion document that is capturing those things that are either don't really need to be handled legally, or they might change so much. Like, okay, for the first half of the year, I was the contact for our team, but for the second half of the year, you're going to be the contact for the team. And if you have those two things, the legal agreement and then this addendum that's more changeable, that captures your agreements about other ways you're going to work together, I think that's a really nice balance.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Kind of a style guide for the relationship and the working relationship, as well as obviously the book itself. You'd want to have those decisions made.
Yep.
Matty, so kind of speaking of workflow, I would love to hear some of the guidelines that you've put in place and some of the project management tools. I know you mentioned that, especially with Mark, you were more the project manager. How do you keep the workflow smooth? What do you do to make sure that things are, you're not both working in the manuscript at the same time or both forgetting that things are due?
Yeah, that's something that Michael and I played with a lot for our first co-authored book. And we tried like Trello as a task management thing. We tried a bunch of different approaches. And what we found was really useful was a shared Google Drive, a spreadsheet for action items, a Google Doc for things like that document I described, where you're managing those other things that don't need to be captured in the contract. So Google Docs was a Google Drive, a shared Google Drive was very useful. We also tried like shared iCloud stuff. That didn't work so well. One of the things that we implemented for managing the actual manuscript. So this is kind of something you need to do in stages. So I think that there's the period of time where you're just collecting stuff. Like if we were working on Collaborate to Create, we could both kind of independently just gush out a bunch of things we'd learned about collaborating. And those also often went onto the Google Drive in a Google Doc. Now, Google Docs are like the least inspirational tool to use, in my opinion. So we tried to get past that as quickly as possible. We also agreed that we would not use Scrivener, for example. Scrivener's awkward to use for co-authoring. There were some new tools that were coming along that were sort of billed as being good for co-authoring, but they didn't offer quite the functionality we wanted to. So there would be this period where we were all just dumping information. And what we came to was an approach where one of us was, after we'd gotten through that initial content creation, there was one person who was doing more of the content creation, Michael, and one person who's doing more of the organization, me. And so we would have all this stuff, and I would be piecing it together. Oh, like we both said the same thing. We don't need that. Or, oh, I'm seeing a hole here. Sometimes when I saw a hole, I would send Michael a note and I'd say, we really need something about tools to to use. Can you put something together? So Michael would produce some content. He would send it to me. I would stick it into the document where I thought it was appropriate. And then once you're past that real just content collection and organization period, and you're moving a little more into the refinement period, what we found worked best was to move it all into a Word document and then only ever have one person working on the Word document at any time. And the metaphor we came up with was from my days as a flying student, where there's the concept of who has the plane. So if I'm flying along with my instructor and I see like something interesting on the ground I want to take a look at, I'll say, oh, I want to take a look at that plane. You have the plane. And my instructor would say, I have the plane. And then I would say, you have the plane again, to make sure everyone was clear about who was controlling the plane. And Michael and I used that, in fact, that exact phrase. So I would be working on the Word document, the one master Word document, for a while. And when I had done whatever my assignment was, or as much as I could do, then I would email it to Michael, and I said, Michael, you have the plane. And then I knew it was with him. It was off my plate. I wasn't going to do anything while he had it. And so that very explicit passing of responsibility, I think, addresses two needs. One is you don't want two people working on it and then having to have the very painful experience of merging those changes. And you also don't want both people to think the other person's working on it when nobody's working on it. And so from the point of view of actually managing the manuscript, that was the approach we came up with. Michael, can you think of other sort of task management or process management things that we put in place that were successful or not successful?
Yeah, I'd say you summarized it pretty well. I think the additional thing that I did, because I'm really paranoid, I've lost manuscripts before, and I think it's really easy to do, especially when you're trading things back and forth. No matter what you do, there's always a risk that you're going to lose something. And so having backups was really important to me. So I have backup software that I have installed on my computer that I just made sure that every time I got a manuscript from Matty, that I made sure that particular document got backed up, just in case we ever had to do a comparison or if we lost data. Statistically speaking, if you're careful, it doesn't happen that often, but it happens to everybody at some point. And I think the worst thing you can do is trade something back and forth or use collaborative software if you want to do that. And then you find out that you've lost entire sections of your manuscript. And in some cases, you don't even know what you lost. So I think that that's a real risk, that if you do enter into a collaboration with someone, you really want to spend some time thinking about how you'll back things up just in case that happens.
Matty, were there any specific project management tools that you used, like a Trello board or Notion or anything like that?
We did experiment with Trello, and I think that the problem with Trello was it's not kind of a destination. I mean, I use Trello all the time, so Trello is always open in my browser. I go that's the first place I go in the morning. But if you don't use it that way, you have to remember to go there. And it's a little more awkward. Like, often I found that if I was doing something in Trello, then the Trello card was a link to a Google document. And so it ended up just being easier to just do it all in Google Documents. And links are your friend, so that so don't manage in email, for example. So if you don't guard against it, what can happen is, someone says, oh, I gave you the plane last week, but I thought of something I'd like to add. So can you pass it back? And then the other person answers it in text. And then you forget that they answered in text, so that you think it hasn't been answered, et cetera, et cetera. And so what I found useful was when there was something substantive like that, I could send Michael an email or send Michael a text and say, I've updated the spreadsheet, or I've updated this document, can you go in there and let me know what you think, or can you mark changes or whatever? So having, as uninspirational as the Google Docs UI is, it is really a very useful way of managing that stuff. And it provides a really nice repository of information. So for example, when we launched our second book, we just already had the task list and an Excel spreadsheet of all our launch action items. And so we could just copy that forward. I think that the other sort of coordination tip I'll suggest is that it's helpful to know like what your partner's preferred communication mechanisms are. So I know, like, I can communicate with Michael via email, but if I really need to get in touch with him quickly, I'll send him a text. When I'm working with Mark, I would send him an email, but oftentimes I would follow it up with a Facebook message. I just think understanding how your partner prefers to get information and how it's possible for them to process it in when something is time critical is also very useful.
I want to go back to something you said about emailing to say, "Hey, I updated this document." It sounds almost like you're saying you have kind of a decision log of like, "Okay, I finished this. I'm handing it here. I'm doing this. I handed it there." So all of these decisions are in the Google document, and then you're just emailing to say, "Hey, check this." Is that correct?
Yeah, I would say it's not quite that clean. I wish it were quite that clean. There are just some things that are easier to do in email or easier to do in a text, and you don't want to get yourself too bound up in those things. But always having somewhere to point the other person to for the consolidated view of all the decisions you've made, and all the tasks that need to be done and the status of those tasks and so on, I think is very important.
That is something that I wish I could just implement with myself and actually stay on top of. That would be so useful. So how did you decide how to split the work? Was it kind of what you both felt you were best at? You mentioned that Michael was more of the creation of the content, you were more organization.
Michael is a content creation machine. And so I could ask for a page about almost anything, and the next day I would have it. And I really like the process of slotting things together. The idea of, oh, this little piece of information, it would be like 95% good here, but it would be 98% good here. I enjoy that. And so it was something that I was happy to take on. Michael, I don't know if you missed doing any of the organizational things or wish you had done less of the content creation things, but that's something that only occurred to us as we worked together for a while, or at least it only occurred to me. So I'll be curious to hear what Michael has to say about that.
Yeah, I think it goes back to synergy, like doing what we do best. Like I'm best when I'm creating content, and I think Maddie's really, really good at the organization piece. I'm a very organized person, but when it comes to what I prefer to be doing, I would prefer to be writing. And so I think that's why we work together so well, is because I can do what I do best and she can do what she does best, and it works out.
Michael, how did you end up splitting that work with your fiction projects?
Yeah, I mean, for me, I always have a million things going on, so I try to prioritize like our timelines. That's one of the things that we're both really good at is timelines. So I can tell Maddie, hey, I've got, like, right now we're working on another collaboration, and I told her, hey, I've got some time until like the middle of August to kind of work on this project, and she'll say, okay, well, you have the plane, and so then I'll take the plane and then I'll send it back to her, and then I'll go work on something else. Right. So we, as best as we can, it doesn't always work out that way. Sometimes she has deadlines that she's working on, and sometimes I have deadlines. And so sometimes the project does sit for a little while, like this current project we're working on. And that's okay, because we're both okay with that timeline. Maddie, I don't know if you want to add anything.
Just that I think it is an interesting illustration of how different co-authoring fiction and co-authoring nonfiction is, because initially when we started working on Collaborate to Create, we were thinking we might address both of those. And then we realized that although certain things are applicable to both, the sort of central part of the book, which was about actually creating the content, was so different, and something that I didn't have a lot of experience in. I've only ever co-authored one short story on the fiction front. And that sort of, you go off and you have an assignment, you go off and do it, or like one person being able to organize things independent of the other person and just going to the other person for a final review. It's so different in fiction. And I think it's the other difference is, and I'd be curious from both of you what you think about this, but I think co-authoring is more difficult on the fiction front because I at least get more sort of emotionally invested in my ideas about my fictional work than I do about my nonfiction work. Like I'm usually pretty happy to negotiate anything about nonfiction content I'm putting out there, and I wouldn't be quite as comfortable on the fiction front. So I think it's a different process and it's a different mindset.
I would absolutely say that. And, the only co-writing project that I have done, I guess, under my name has been fiction. I'm a ghostwriter, so I do a lot of co-writing, but I'm doing it for someone else. But with my nonfiction books or my fiction books, if you ask me to change something in the nonfiction, I'm like, oh yeah, no problem. I'm very comfortable being edited in nonfiction. But you're right, it does get more emotional when it comes to the fiction.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think fiction, when you're collaborating with fiction, it's more problem solving. Like it, like when you write a novel, like, okay, so Maddie and I, we work on projects and, she has her projects and I have my projects and we slot time to work on the nonfiction projects as our time allows. Fiction, it's more of a linear, like once you start building momentum, you really don't want to give up that momentum. Like it kind of needs to be like your primary project. And yeah, you do get more emotionally invested in it. I know Justin and I had some pretty earnest conversations about plot and details and things like that. But ultimately, you're problem solving a lot more because there are lots of problems that come up. I mean, right? Everyone probably watching this has written a novel at some point. You know what I'm talking about, right? So how do you get character from point A to point B? If the character is in this state, how did they get in that state? Um, like emotional state. Does that make sense? They're just little logistical things and little plot hole things that come up and world building things that come up. And so you really, again, you want to have somebody that you're going to be okay problem solving with and okay coming into disagreements and butting heads and trying to figure out a solution. So like when Justin and I would come up with we would have problems with the plot or with the character or details or things like that. We would try to often find the middle ground. And often we would default to, well, what would a reader expect? Like what would make the most sense to a reader? And if you can kind of have like that guiding philosophy, it kind of helps take the ego out of it a little bit because, it's not so much what you want or what they want. It's what is best for the reader. And again, you're going to be entering into a lot of, at least 1,000 problems that you're going to solve over the course of a novel. So you want to be comfortable being able to solve problems and build with whoever it is that you're collaborating with.
Yeah, I think a good example of how that's much easier on the nonfiction front is that we have a section in From Page to Platform about being a traveling speaker, and we were sharing all our tips about travel. And so Michael had put something in about getting travel insurance and like framing it as a very strong recommendation. And I was like, I don't object to travel insurance, but I myself don't always get travel insurance. I do now, but at the time I didn't. And I said, I'm fine recommending it, but I don't feel comfortable saying that this is something I don't feel comfortable implying it's something I do when it's not something I do. So we solved it by saying, Michael strongly recommends that all, speakers who are traveling get travel insurance. Problem solved.
Right.
So it's much more a sort of tactical negotiation than like an emotional negotiation, as I think it would be more likely to be for fiction.
I want to pivot and talk a little bit about some of the other types of collaborating you've done as a result of these books. So creating that workbook or doing presentations, interviews like this. As you both have said, this is a creative marriage that goes well beyond the life of the project itself. So what other sorts of collaborations have you two done as a result of this book? And then have you seen anything that you haven't done yet that you'd like to try? Michael, let's start with you.
Yeah. So presentations is one thing that we've done quite a bit of. So we've done workshops, we've done presentations and talks, and it's a collaborative experience taking the book and kind of adapting it to presentation. And I think that was a lot easier. I mean, naturally, like we figure out who takes the lead on creating the content, and then the other person reviews the slides, and sometimes we hop on calls and just make sure that this is appropriate. It's a pretty straightforward process, I would say. Giving talks, it depends on the type of talk, right? So we've given hour presentations, and we've also given like 8-hour presentations, like 8-hour workshops. So like coming up with exercises, but I think it helps that most of our talks have been based on content we already created. So it's just a matter of how do you adapt that content into something else. But I think outside of collaborating, like Maddie and I both have complementary nonfiction businesses, right? So Maddie does consulting, and so sometimes I don't do consulting. So whenever someone comes to me and asks, hey, dude, Michael, do you do consulting? I use instead of running away with my hands in the air screaming, I just send them to Maddie, and it works out great, right? And so we kind of trade opportunities, and we're both in our each other's network for things that maybe come through that maybe it doesn't work out for me, but maybe it makes sense for her. And because we've collaborated together, we can recommend each other very strongly. And folks that we work with know that, okay, maybe we can't work with Michael, but if he highly recommends Maddie, then we're in good hands. Maddie, do you want to add anything?
No, just that I hope that I'm in a position to return all the leads you've you've passed to me at some point.
Oh, it's all good.
A very, very tactical suggestion, because I happen behind the Zoom, I happen to have up the presentation that Michael and I often give on this topic. And one of the things we realized was sort of a specialty of co-presenting is who's up. And so what we ended up doing is on the slides, we have my logo on one corner and Michael's logo on the other corner. And this probably isn't apparent to attendees, but there's like a little star next to whoever is supposed to do that slide, because otherwise I would never remember like when I'm supposed to turn something over to Michael. And so if I flip a slide and I see, oh, now the star is next to the Author Level Up logo, not next to the Indie Author logo, now I know it's Michael's turn. And it's also nice, like in advance when we're preparing, if it's something we just need to check in on very briefly, we can just say, oh, okay, I'm glancing at these slides and I see which ones I'm going to be focusing on. So anything I think that makes just the logistics of it as smooth as possible, those little tricks can smooth the way to having it be a productive and comfortable effort, and not an effortful one.
That is a fantastic tactical tip. Thank you. So, as you have collaborated now on two books and you're working on a third, what has shifted about your process? Are there any things that you tried earlier that you've changed, or say mistakes that you made earlier that you're doing differently this time?
I can take
Maddie,
a shot at
sorry.
that. Yeah. So I think that most of the changes we made were either made while we were working on From Page to Platform. I think by the time we got to the end of From Page to Platform, we had it pretty much down. It was pretty much the process I described. And, the roles, I think we've kind of fallen into those roles. I think that the ways that would change over time I think there are more of those opportunities to use the content we're putting together in different ways. So, for example, I was just putting together, I have a Substack for my From Expertise to Authority platform, and I was writing an article about how to deal with an audience that, responds in a hostile way to something you have to say. And Michael and I had a section on hecklers in From Page to Platform. And so I asked Michael if I could explicitly use that section of the book in the article where I thought it would make sense, and got the okay from him. So I think that it's more like plumbing the depths of the content you've created and making sure you're making the most use of it for yourselves and making the most use of it for the people that you want to reach and to benefit. And so, I think that could be more and different tailored presentation offerings, or like maybe down the road we would do joint consulting. I don't even know what that would look like, but I think it's more, how do we expand it more so than how do we create a book?
So we did have a few audience questions that I wanted to jump to. One of which, since we were talking a little bit about the timeline and passing books back and forth and working on different projects concurrently, somebody wanted to know, how much time do you save by co-writing a book? And you're
I'll
both
take that
laughing.
one. Yeah, I'll take that one. So we've talked about this, and we talk about it in our book too. If you're getting into co-authoring because you think that it will save you time and effort, co-authoring is not for you. I would say Maddie and I don't save any time by co-authoring a book. In fact, I think a lot of the books that we write, probably we could very easily write that same book by ourselves a lot faster. I think really co-authoring is more of a mind meld, and it's about like it. Okay, so if I wrote a book about speaking, right? I could write a book about speaking, no problem, but it wouldn't have the same nuance in a lot of Maddie's contributions, right? And so it's really a mind meld. So you're really not saving time. I would think about it more as you are addressing a problem from more perspectives than you could do just by yourself. And I think that in and of itself is worth the extra time and effort that it would take to be able to collaborate a novel. Yeah, are there some people out there that maybe they can write faster because they divide the labor up a little bit differently than Maddie and I do. Maybe one person's in charge of the writing, another person's in charge of the marketing, and so maybe it's easier that way. Yeah, I think there are certain personality types that could work together to save time, in writing a book. But I just don't think that is the main reason why I would do it.
Yeah, I agree. And I also think you actually have to be more flexible timing wise with a co-authored work because, over the course of 2+ co-authored works, Michael and I have both encountered periods of time where we thought we were going to be able to be working on the book and we couldn't. At one point, we had a big flood in my house and there wasn't a lot of work getting done. And so I think you have to go into it realizing that even if you're both, giving it your best shot, there are just going to be things that come up that are going to mess with any ideal scenario. And so you're dealing not only with your own set of those things, but the other person's set of those things as well. So you have to be flexible in that sense.
That was certainly my experience as well when I was co-writing a fiction book. It did not take less time for sure because there's so much back and forth and there's so much waiting on someone else's schedule and yeah, but it's a very rewarding process.
Yeah, and the only thing I would add is that you're also tapping into cross-promotional opportunities. So if I write a book on speaking, then I'm going to be marketing it to my audience. But if I write a book on speaking with Michael, we're going to be marketing it to both our audiences, and that's a really nice benefit.
Matty, can you elaborate a little bit more on some of the marketing opportunities and just the ways that marketing a co-written book is different than something you wrote yourself?
I don't know that I'm bringing a lot of differences to solo nonfiction books versus co-authored nonfiction books. It is more tapping into that ability to reach two sets of audiences. So, for example, for many years, each month I put one of my novels on sale for 99 cents, and I have a whole set of promotions related to that for that month. And I've started doing that with my nonfiction books as well. So I cycle through each month. I'm focusing on one, and this month happened to be, conveniently enough, Collaborate to Create. And so I've pulled out a bunch of tips. I pull out like 31 tips from the book, and I publish those on social media. I'm using a social media posting tool, so they're going out to Facebook and LinkedIn and Instagram and X and Threads and Mastodon and others. And then I'll flag Michael in there. So he'll see that and, he can share that out with his audience. I think finding ways to just alert his audience that is out there and would be of interest to them because they're followers of Michael is useful. So that has been more my focus, has been doing the same things, but making it easy for the other person to participate in them.
Yeah, and Maddie is definitely more on social media than I am. I'm really not big on social media. I prefer like YouTube and newsletter and other avenues, and so it is helpful to be able to have that as well.
Another audience question that I had, actually several people asked a variation on this question, and I noticed you got asked it in the presentation you did for Authors Guild as well, which is what happens when things go disastrously wrong, which obviously has not happened to you, but I wonder if you have some advice for people where things might be going sideways.
So I think that if you follow the advice we gave about signing a contract and having this companion document that outlines some of your agreements, if you do the due diligence we talked about, then you greatly reduce the chance of that happening. I think there are also circumstances where it's not like something horrible has happened, like one person turns out to be a thief or something like that, but the things just change. And so an example of that might be that let's say one person gets a day job. You were both writing full time, but then one person gets a 9 to 5 job and they just don't have the time to invest in the continued marketing, let's say. So at that point, you might say, well, now it's time for an upgrade to the contract, because if person A, who's still really focused on this, is going to be doing most of the promotion and admin and all those other things, then maybe they deserve more of the royalties than the person who's kind of sitting back and now just, passively accepting the royalties. So now maybe the split is 60-40 or 70-30 or something like that. So I think some things that one's first response might be, oh my God, can be addressed in ways that aren't traumatic. Those are some of the happier scenarios. Michael, do you want to delve into some others, or do you want to speculate about the more dire circumstances?
Yeah, I mean, I think that one is a relatively innocuous one. I think what's more common is when there is just a difference of direction, right? Where one person just wants to go a different direction with their career than the other person. Maybe, there's some sort of controversy or scandal, or, who knows, right? That's just what I would say is that you can prevent a lot of this by, in your contract, specifying what happens if you just both disagree or both just want to walk away, or if one person wants to walk away, what happens, right? Or, if there's some sort of a weird thing that pops up, what do you do? And if you lay that out in the contract, if you say, okay, well, what happens if one person wants to unpublish the book, right? Or one person just doesn't want their name on it anymore. Like say Matty, robs a bakery one day and I don't want to be associated with her. So, what happens? Do I just take my name off of the book, and do I still receive the royalties? Do we unpublish the book? These things can be resolved if you just think them through a little bit. But you're not going to be able to come up with every potential scenario. So you just want to build in something like a kill switch. Like, what happens if both of you want to walk away? And having that in writing just makes it so much easier, because then you don't have to spend the time and resources, heaven forbid, going to a lawyer, or a mediator or something like that. It just makes your life a lot easier. And I know some people have a hard time hearing this because they think to themselves, well, I don't want to think through that. That stresses me out. But it's less stressful to think about it up front and put it in the contract than it is to deal with it at the time when you have to figure out. Because here's what happens. If you publish a book and you're not selling very many copies, probably not going to be the end of the world if you have a disagreement about direction. The problem is what happens when you publish something or you collaborate on something that is wildly successful, and then you have a difference of direction. That's the sort of scenario that you want to be prepared for.
Yeah, that's great advice. To wrap things up, I just wanted to ask, do either of you have a final piece of advice for anyone who's considering co-writing a book? And Michael, why don't you start?
Yeah, I would say, my final piece of advice would be to follow your gut. Generally, you have, within a conversation with somebody, your gut is probably giving you a lot of information about what it would be like to work with that person. And it's always a good idea to follow your gut. And that is probably true. It's true of every collaboration I've worked at. I know that when I talked to Matty a few times and we talked about writing the book, right, where she suggested, hey, we should write a book about that, I felt really comfortable with Matty, right? And we've had a great working relationship. Same thing with Justin, right? And so I probably would want to collaborate with someone in the future, probably on fiction. And if I'm interviewing somebody and having a conversation about a collaboration, I want to feel comfortable with that person. And so I think your gut will tell you a lot about potential red flags. And that would be my advice. Matty?
Yeah, I think that the idea of just continuing to check in, like, don't let the book go out and then you never see each other again. Because I do think that these opportunities come up that if you're not having some sort of regular check-in, that could just be an email or something like that, then it just trickles to the back burner, mixing metaphors, but it falls off your radar and you may be missing opportunities. So I think just having a chance every month, every quarter, like every year, whatever makes sense, and check in and say, hey, are there more audiences we can be reaching this with? Is there another approach we should be using for marketing? Is it time for a second edition? I mean, Mark and I found that with taking the short tack that I saw a review saying that some of the examples we were using were sort of dated. And so I looked through the book and I was like, yeah, it's been 5 years, son of a gun. Some of those are pretty dated. And so, Mark and I decided that we were going to embark on a second edition. I think just continuing to care for that in the same way that I hope everyone's caring for their own solo authored work is important.
Well, awesome. Thank you both. This has been incredibly helpful, very thought-provoking. So I hope people have gotten a lot out of this. Yeah, I just want to thank you both for coming. Again, I will drop links to your resources, your websites in the show notes, and I really appreciate it. Thanks, you guys.
Thank you for the
Thanks,
invitation.
Jesse.